Okay, class, this is Dr. Weiss, and we've had a little hiatus from my lectures, but now I'm going to start to talk to you about Aristotle and Aristotle's view of rhetoric. Before I get into Aristotle, I just wanted to clarify something about papers. When I assigned the first paper, I said that I was expecting the paper in about 2 weeks, and the way I've set up this class is I want you to be able to work at your own pace. So there's no precise deadline for handing in a paper. A paper isn't late, so don't hurry to get it done just because I said I was moving on to the next subject. What I did was I purposely let you time to write the paper and didn't go into the next subject matter because I didn't want to confuse your thinking about Plato's view of rhetoric while I was talking about Aristotle's view of rhetoric, which is a quite different sort of issue. So I hope that's clear and understandable to you. Anyway, so now we're going to move on to Aristotle, and after we're done this section, I'll assign yet another paper. Aristotle's writing on rhetoric is a lot more complex and detailed than Plato's, and we got a lot more stuff to cover, but I think you'll find it interesting, and you'll also find out that it's basically the origin, the source, and the basis for all of the communication we study in modern times. It was created by Aristotle. So before we get into the specifics of Aristotle's rhetoric, let's talk about a little bit about who Aristotle was. First of all, you can see on the screen the years that he lived, 384 to 322 BCE. So he didn't live that long. And he was a student of Plato's. And so in large part what he's doing with his system of rhetoric is responding to Plato's criticism of it, and also talking about how Plato's system was different in kind than the one he developed. So we'll get a little bit into all that stuff. So anyway, let's talk about what happened during his life. First of all, he was a student of Plato's. Plato opened that school, which I mentioned in my previous lecture, called the Academy, and that's where philosophy was taught. Aristotle himself was not an Athenian. He was from Macedonia, which was part of the greater Greek Empire region, but it was not Greece or Athens per se, obviously. And he was from a little town called Stagira, which you can still find on a map. He was born about the exact same time that Plato was opening his school. At the age of 7, he went to Athens and entered the academy, so obviously his family had enough money to send him to a private school for a good education. And by the way, that was the fashion in the ancient world, both in Greece and Rome, that students would begin their studies at very young ages, even for advanced or professional degrees. So if you were going to become a lawyer, you might actually begin studying that as a young child. He entered the academy, and after he finished the academy, he actually stayed there and worked as part of the faculty, and stayed for 20 years and left when Plato died. He was not eligible to inherit the academy, which was perhaps one of Plato's wishes, because he wasn't an Athenian and wasn't allowed to acquire property through a will, and so started his own school. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Like Plato, he studied a vast array of subjects. He taught biology, politics, rhetoric, zoology, ethics, philosophy, logic, science, demonstration, just psychology, just a host of things. As a matter of fact, he's usually referred to as what's called a polymath, a person who knows something about everything. Some people even say that Aristotle was an alien because nobody could have known as much as he did and still have come from Earth at that time, because only an advanced civilization could have produced somebody who had that much knowledge. At least that's the way the argument goes. Anyway, he was very much into logic and science and scientific demonstration. And most of his philosophical curriculum that he taught to his students involved the mastery of logic and the rules of logic. And as a matter of fact, all the way up through the Middle Ages and even up to modern times, to study logic meant basically to study Aristotle's system. The whole medieval system of education was based on what Aristotle wrote about every subject matter. Okay, he also talked about two divisions in the area of human inquiry or human knowledge, and those were dialectic and rhetoric. Now, you may remember the word dialectic. Dialectic was the term that Socrates and Plato used to describe the logical philosophical discussion that one could have that would lead you to truth. And that was contrasted with rhetoric, which was the process of developing a message for persuasion. And so Aristotle was the first person to basically say that these two things go hand in hand. Plato would certainly say dialectic was good and rhetoric was primarily bad. Aristotle was saying that rhetoric and dialectic are part and parcel of the same thing. And we'll get in a little bit later, more specifically, how he makes that claim and how he explains it, which is, I think, kind of beautiful in terms of his rhetorical theory. He looked around at all the teaching about rhetoric that was currently available at the time, and he synthesized it, meaning he pulled the best things from all the existing systems and put them into his system, and he also excludes or removes things that are neither effective nor justifiable as parts of a system of rhetoric. And he also took Plato's basic idea and introduced some new twists. Now, he had a unique definition of rhetoric. The sophists basically defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion, but Aristotle defined rhetoric as the art of discovering the means of persuasion available for any subject. This discovery actually requires a sort of scientific or logical investigation of the subject matter. So sophists would never do this. Sophists would tell their students or their clients, here is what you will need to say to have X effect on an audience. Aristotle will say, I'm trying to persuade an audience of X. What are the available means of persuasion? And he will survey all the possible arguments and lines of argument that are available to him, and then present those as the options to the rhetor or the rhetorician. So that's a very different concept of rhetoric, a very different definition, a very different approach. For Aristotle, most of the work of persuading is not in making a speech to a judge or an audience. Most of the work of rhetoric is thinking through in your mind the best arguments you could possibly come up with that would persuade the judge or the audience. That's a very different process. He liked Plato, believed that the rhetorician must start with knowledge. Aristotle would never think of anybody leaving his school trained in any subject, including rhetoric, without having real mastery or knowledge of the subject matter. He wouldn't be basing anything that they taught or knew about that subject matter on doxa, or what the Greeks called in Greek doxa, pure opinion or just uninformed opinion. He says in Book 3, Chapter 1 of the Rhetoric, the way in which a thing is said does affect its intelligibility, but only owing to the defects of the hearers. And that means that not all audiences are smart or sophisticated, and therefore he doesn't really accept the idea that rhetoric is not an art, because it tries to persuade audiences or masses the way Plato criticized it. He thinks it is an art, but he thinks that the problem with the art is that it's too often adapted to the hearers, and sometimes the hearers are not literate or smart or intelligent or educated. Okay, so that's the problem. So the contrast between the two systems of discourse, according to Aristotle, is that rhetoric is the art of public speaking and dialectic is the art of logical discussion. And he feels they're both part of a universe of discourse where everyone who's really well educated in communication and the ability to communicate messages effectively would learn both of those things. Okay? Now, like Plato in the Phaedrus, where he set forward the idea that the true rhetorician would know something about the nature of the soul of the person he was persuading, Aristotle is very much interested in the psyche or the psychology of the audience. It turns out that in Greek, the word psyche could be used both to describe your mind and also your soul, and so as a result, those two ideas are completely compatible. So his shift is a little more toward audience analysis, whereas Plato's was a little bit more toward an analysis of the nature of the souls that were being persuaded. And he also feels that rhetoric is very practical, because a lot of the decisions that we have to make and for which we have to make speeches and about which we have to argue are really practical questions. So in that regard, he realizes it has a totally practical application. There's a little bit of my slide cut off there at the bottom. It says like Isocrates, because Isocrates, who I've mentioned a couple times in some of the other lectures, he also had a school of rhetoric, and his training was a little bit more philosophical than some of the other sophists, and it was designed toward very practical ends, for example, being an effective politician or an effective administrator of justice. As I mentioned before, Aristotle was very interested in the psychology of rhetoric. As a matter of fact, he spends a whole big section of the last part of rhetoric cataloging the emotions and talking about how different types of messages actually work differently on different types of emotions. Okay. He also feels that rhetoric is useful in making decisions where true knowledge is not available. There's always something in our experience as human beings that we call the contingent, that which we need to make decisions about, but which we cannot ultimately ascertain the ultimate truth of them. A good example of that, by the way, is right now we're having a big discussion about guns in the United States. Okay, so you'll hear all types of assertions and arguments about what the best thing to do is, but the fact of the matter is both sides of the argument don't really know. Nobody can say for sure that this or that thing causes some other thing, and that doing this or that thing will have the cause of making the situation better or worse. It's really a kind of a crapshoot, but we still do have to make decisions. For example, when you see somebody who's in danger, okay, and you might run to try to help them, it doesn't mean it's necessarily the best idea to run and help them, okay, but you're going to do it anyway because you have to make decisions, right? We can't just always not be making decisions. So not everything is always informed by complete knowledge and scientific demonstration and logic. We still have to make decisions. Next thing that Aristotle offers in rhetoric, which is a real innovation, is the idea of enthymemes. I'm not going to go into a lot about that now. I'm going to save that for another lecture, because I'm going to have several lectures on Aristotle. But just to make it very brief, an enthymeme is a special type of logic that's used in rhetoric. So Aristotle, because he was a logician, meaning he taught logic and he was a master of logic, had a very great understanding of enthymemes and what they were. And so as a result, he was able to discuss them at length in the book. There's also other works that he wrote where he talks about enthymemes too and other types of logical techniques. So he's really got that kind of monopolized as far as the classics go. Also talks about different contexts where rhetoric is used. One context is law. So speeches are sometimes designed just to be given in court for the judge or a jury to render a decision. Other times speeches are to what are called praise or blame. There's a fancy Greek word for that. It's called epideictic. And that's the kind of speech you would give on a special occasion. Like, for example, the 4th of July, a wedding, a graduation. And that's where we usually reinforce values. And finally, political debate. Okay? And that's where the assembly or a Congress or some organization votes on actions, policies. They deliberate and they make laws. So the sophists tended to focus just on legal rhetoric and how to help people be effective in court, but Aristotle focused on legal rhetoric, epideictic rhetoric, rhetoric which plays the games, and political, or sometimes called deliberative rhetoric. And so he wasn't just concerned with a speech, but also the action that would result from a speech, because in all three of those types of speeches, there would be different action that would result. He also felt, and he was kind of a political scientist too, he wrote some major works on politics and government, that speakers must understand the forms of government so they can adapt their arguments and their proposals to the ruler to be persuaded. And that's especially true in political rhetoric or deliberative rhetoric. Okay, now of the three major people we've studied so far and their views of rhetoric, there's an interesting contrast. First of all, Plato. Plato believes that there's a form of reality that exists outside of human existence. Behind every object is a reality, right? And we can't really know that, but we're trying to know it. It's separated from us, okay? And so whatever we communicate as human beings is merely a reflection of that. In other words, it's the image of that. It's kind of like thinking like when you're watching television and you're seeing images on television, right? That's not reality. It's a reflection of reality. He feels communication is a reflection of whatever reality actually exists. He's a metaphysician, to use a fancy word. Aristotle is a little bit more practical about the nature of reality. He thinks reality is a real thing. It's accessible by human beings. But his view is that we can't know for certain what the nature of reality is, but we probably have a good insight into it. And what gives us insight into it is things like experience and science and demonstration, and the fact that there's a lot of consistency in what we do experience in our lives. So communication, therefore, is not a reflection of reality. It's not an image of it. It's actually the way that we exist in reality. It's a relationship. We go back and forth between other human beings in a real world. We have real conversations, and everything that we're trying to do through communication is just as real as anything else. Now, Gorgias is what we call a nihilist, N-I-H-I-L-I-S-T, nihilist. Nihil in Greek means nothing. So his belief is that there is no reality. At least you can't demonstrate it. He believes that there's nothing can be proved or demonstrated, and that communication creates reality. Now, for those of you who have taken communication theory or any other course in communication, you might know about the notion of what's called social constructivism, which is the idea that communication theorists use to describe that the only thing that we can know are things that we communicate with each other, so that all reality and all knowledge is created through communication. This is the idea that Gorgias enunciated over 2,500 years ago. So I guess he was way ahead of his time. He would be a great contemporary communication theorist. Now, rhetoric has its own identity, according to Aristotle. You remember that Plato's criticism of rhetoric was it wasn't a subject, it wasn't an art, and every field has some form of rhetoric that it has to employ in order to persuade people or use language effectively. But Aristotle has a different view. First of all, he says it is its own subject matter. Just like dialectic is its own method of reaching logical conclusions, rhetoric is its own method of enunciating messages designed to persuade. And therefore, it is an art, and it's not cookery, as Plato described it. It's not just a knack or some trick. Okay? He also felt that there are no moral problems with rhetoric. Plato said that rhetoric was immoral. It could be used for immoral purposes. But he feels that rhetoric has nothing to do with morality. It's the person who uses it that makes it immoral. Rhetoric is just a tool for communication, and therefore it's pragmatic, and it also has principles that can be enunciated, that can be used by anyone, whether they're moral or not. So it's the same no matter who uses it. It also looks at all the available means of persuasion, and by that we're talking about things like what you can do as a speaker to improve your chance of persuading, or what you can do with your speech, or what you can do in analyzing or thinking about the audience. All the artistry or the creativity or the logical thinking that's available to the speaker as a means of persuading. That's what rhetoric is, and that's what is studied in his system of rhetoric. And it functions to discover in each context the best way to be successful. So it's very, very specific to whether you're trying to persuade in the law courts, persuade in the assembly, persuade in the ceremonial or occasional environment. He's very cognizant of the fact that whatever you're trying to accomplish in a speech is very much related to the type of thought process and investigation you're going to go through to find the best means of persuasion. I'm going to wrap up this section by talking about how Aristotle considers rhetoric to be a useful thing. Whereas Plato had criticized it and said it was mostly a bad thing, Aristotle mostly praises it and says it's primarily a very useful thing. And again, it's not moral or immoral, it's just amoral. It's something that you can use. So why is rhetoric useful? First of all, if somebody was on the wrong side of an issue and had rhetoric available to him, and you were on the right side of an issue and didn't have rhetoric available to you, then the right side of the issue would not prevail because it'd be beaten by the wrong side. So if the person who's on the right side, the person who stands for justice and truth, okay, is using rhetoric, then he might have the tendency to overcome or defeat his opponent and therefore prevent a fraud and injustice. So think about it. If somebody was lying about you in court and you didn't have a weapon available to answer him, then you might be convicted of a crime that you didn't commit, right? Aristotle says that wouldn't be fair to have truth not triumph because it didn't have rhetoric available to it as a defense. Also, rhetoric is very helpful in people learning things. It aids in instruction because once you are deciding that you need to make an argument or make a speech, you're going to have to investigate the question that you're trying to persuade about, so you'll have to study it and you're going to acquire knowledge about that subject matter. So for example, if I'm going to persuade you we need to do something about global warming, I'm going to actually have to get instruction in global warming. I'm going to have to read science books and do research, and I'm going to maybe have to take courses. So that's why rhetoric aids in instruction. The rhetor, in attempting to find the available means of persuasion, must pursue a course of study and knowledge about the subject. Also, rhetoric invites us to consider the pros and cons of our positions. As we're developing our arguments, it naturally comes to our minds, well, what if somebody argues this in response to what I'm saying? Is my argument going to fail, or am I not going to succeed because the other side has a more powerful argument? So it's good to see the other side first, because the other side might be actually better or more correct, but also it enables us to strengthen our arguments to combat any possible opponent's arguments. Finally, rhetoric is very helpful in defending oneself. If someone comes at you with arguments and has good rhetorical skills, if they're very good at persuading or firing off arguments, if you have the same set of skills, you can defend yourself. This goes back to my idea from an earlier talk about the Karate Kid, and I was talking about, remember that karate can be used for self-defense, but you don't necessarily have to use it for offense. And Aristotle basically believes that rhetoric is one of those tools that once you teach it to someone, okay, they don't necessarily have to abuse it or use it wrongly or hurt somebody with it, but they can certainly defend themselves. Okay, so that's the end of this talk. It's kind of an overview. Next, I'm going to actually go into some of the very important sections of the chapters, and that'll be the next lecture I'll record. So I'll be back shortly.